Ok. Bom dia a todos. Para mais uma das nossas aulas aqui do programa de pós-graduação em Direito da Universidade Federal da Bahia. Hoje nós vamos discutir a obra de Thusgood Marshal, primeiro jurista negro a ocupar a Suprema Corte dos Estados Unidos. E nós vamos ter a apresentação do mestrando Ulisses Passos e também vamos ter, após a presença do professor Kenneth Williams, que é professor da Texas Tech University em Houston, nos Estados Unidos. O professor Kenneth Williams é um professor querido, que tem uma relação muito forte aqui com a nossa universidade e que logo após a apresentação de Ulisses vai estar nos brindando aí com sua palestra. Muito obrigado a todos e muito obrigado, professor Kenneth, por thank you for coming. E passo a palavra para Ulisses fazer a apresentação dele. Ulisses, boa sorte.
Obrigado, professor. Bom dia. Bom dia aos colegas que estão nos acompanhando. Bom dia a todos e todas que estão na transmissão. Agradecer inicialmente ao programa de pós-graduação em Direito da Universidade Federal da Bahia por propiciar esse momento tão intenso de troca de conhecimento que vai acontecer agora. O professor Heron, que foi o idealizador da disciplina e também o nosso condutor nesses estudos de alto valor jurídico, no resgate de personalidades negras que muito contribuíram e ainda contribuem com seu legado no estudo da ciência do direito. Bem, hoje falaremos sobre o Thusgood Marshal, um grande jurista estadunidense, e a gente vai discutir direitos e relações raciais também nos Estados Unidos, em paralelo com o Brasil. Por favor, professor. Bem, direito e relações raciais nos Estados Unidos da América sempre se deu a partir da dinâmica do conflito, né? Não só nos Estados Unidos da América, mas em toda a América em que houve o processo de escravização, né? Escravização africana. Esse conflito ele se deu a partir do tráfico de escravizados, na verdade, primeiro do comércio transatlântico de escravizados, que foram ocupando aquela colônia, né? As 13 colônias da Inglaterra, que logo depois se tornaram os Estados Unidos da América. Esse tráfico de escravizados, que é a nossa primeira pauta introdutória para poder discutir aqui o direito e relações raciais, aconteceu num período de 1501 a 1866, né? É onde nós temos esses relatos de vinda de africanos para os Estados Unidos, sequestrados, né, e transportados através de navios tumbeiros. Estima-se que entre 12,5 a 20 milhões de africanos foram sequestrados e transportados para serem vendidos, né, como escravizados nos Estados Unidos. Nessa travessia também estima-se que 15% dos africanos morreram. Por isso que os navios eram conhecidos como navios tumbeiros, né, navios que eram tumbas ambulantes que inclusive afetavam o meio ambiente da época, ao relato do próprio Malcolm X, que diz que os tubarões perseguiam os navios tumbeiros, né, porque sabiam que cedo ou tarde haveria alimento, né, corpos, sejam vivos ou mortos, seriam jogados no mar, no Atlântico Norte. Grande parte dos africanos que chegaram foram escravizados e outros, naturalmente, morreram também no processo de captura. Essa escravização nos Estados Unidos, ela foi impactante porque ela atingiu seu pico de 4 milhões de pessoas em cativeiro, e isso em 1860, nas vésperas da Guerra Civil Americana, a Guerra de Secessão, ela representava cerca de 13% da população do país. Embora num número relativamente, proporcionalmente menor do que aconteceu no Brasil, 13% da população é um quantitativo expressivo e é a população que mais produzia nos Estados Unidos. Era o modo de produção colonial. Pode passar, professor, por favor. Bem, dentro dessa lógica de escravidão, nós temos algumas consequências jurídicas, né? Ela era a escravização institucionalizada. Após o fim dessa escravização institucionalizada, surgiram as leis de segregação, né? Que faziam essa relação entre a população ex-escravizada, o Estado e a população não negra. E é a partir desse estudo dessas legislações que nós vamos seguir agora, e também o movimento pelos direitos civis, que foi um movimento de reação da população afro-americana diante das leis de segregação. Pode passar, professor. Esses movimentos de direitos civis, eles atuaram em diversos cenários. Parte desse cenário se deu dentro do sistema de justiça estadunidense. O sistema de justiça foi um catalisador da concessão de direitos civis, da luta pelos direitos civis. Existiram várias frentes, mas o sistema de justiça foi relevantes nessa atuação de direitos civis que merece que nós citemos aqui de modo breve. Uma das jurisprudências relevantes e que também teve a atuação do Thusgood Marshal foi o Brown vs. Board of Education. Foi uma decisão da Suprema Corte, uma decisão histórica que declarou a segregação raciais das escolas públicas como inconstitucional nos Estados Unidos como um todo, né? Isso abriu caminho para que a dessegregação e o maior acesso à educação da população afro-americana. Entre essa, outra jurisprudência bastante relevante foi também a Shelby County vs. Holter, né? Em que a Suprema Corte também enfraqueceu a lei de direito dos votos, reduzindo a proteção federal contra a discriminação no processo eleitoral. Esses movimentos sociais, né, esses movimentos sociais e a advocacia jurídica, ela se organizou a partir de algumas organizações que faziam já frente ao processo de luta pelos direitos civis dos Estados Unidos. A principal dela, a NAACP, né, que em português significa Associação Nacional para o Avanço das Pessoas de Cor, e a ACLU, que em português significa União Americana pelas Liberdades Civis, ambas desempenharam um papel fundamental nessa busca pela advocacia pública. O que é advocacia pública? O que é advocacia pública nesse sentido? São processos coletivos, né, que visam atingir toda uma coletividade, né? Não apenas um caso específico que vai ser defendido, como era a prática antes dessas organizações assumirem o fronte desses movimentos. A gente também tem vários movimentos de massa, e aí a gente pode citar os movimentos que aconteceram organizadas pelo pastor Martin Luther King, e logo posteriormente depois pelas Panteras Negras, Malcolm X, enfim, uma série de outros movimentos que foram essenciais para que a gente conseguisse a partir da experiência estadunidense afro-americana e quebrando as barreiras da discriminação também no sistema de justiça. E isso trouxe naturalmente um impacto judicial, porque começaram a surgir decisões judiciais que iam aos poucos vencendo esse processo de segregação. Nesse contexto, pode passar, professor, a gente vai chegar no nosso protagonista de hoje, que é vamos estudar o legado do Thurgood Marshal. Quem foi o Thurgood Marshal? Né? Ele foi um advogado preto, nasceu em 1908 e foi o pioneiro na luta pelos direitos civis nos Estados Unidos a partir do sistema de justiça. Ele desempenhou, com o seu trabalho na NAACP, como diretor jurídico, o papel de viajar o país e defendendo pessoas afro-americanas que eram discriminadas pelo sistema de justiça pelo simples fato de serem pessoas negras, pelo simples fato de serem pessoas descendentes de africano. E nos mais diversos casos, sejam debates administrativos, criminais, cíveis, o sistema de justiça estadunidense era, e ainda continua sendo, mas na época era muito mais racializado, né? Era extremamente injusto, porque as decisões eram pautadas não nos fatos, mas sim na cor da pele das pessoas que estavam em julgamento. Pode passar, professor. A partir daí, não só isso, o Marshal também ele teve um papel essencial na educação jurídica, né? As decisões do Marshal e a forma como ele atuou também foram essenciais na construção de currículos inclusivos, engajamento comunitário, liderança comprometida, tudo isso foi construído a partir da atuação do Marshal ao longo da sua brilhante carreira. No próximo slide, a gente consegue ver o que que fez do Marshal um advogado que transformou a realidade dos Estados Unidos, né? Ele atuou a partir da educação excepcional, né? Ele se formou com honras na Universidade de Harvard, inclusive é uma universidade que tinha uma fama, né, de formar juristas não tão boa, né? Ele foi aprovado né, para poder ingressar numa universidade mais renomada. No entanto, a matrícula dele não foi aceita pelo fato dele ser um homem negro, e isso o relegou a estudar em uma universidade que não era tão bem vista assim à época, mas isso não limitou o seu sucesso e a sua brilhante atuação. Depois ele foi pioneiro, né, na advocacy, né, no processo de advocacia pública, e ficou muito conhecido pela histórica decisão de Brown e o Conselho de Educação, que derrubou a doutrina de separados mais iguais, que era a doutrina de segregação escolar. O Marshal também foi um defensor incansável, porque ele dedicou toda a sua carreira, toda a sua vida a combater a discriminação racial e a promover a igualdade de oportunidades para a comunidade afro-brasileira a partir do sistema de justiça. Bem, o Marshal também ele foi o primeiro afro-americano a ser nomeado como ministro da Suprema Corte, né, o que no Brasil seria o nosso Supremo Tribunal Federal. Isso aconteceu em 1967, né, dentro desse contexto da luta pelos direitos civis. Ele foi nomeado como ministro da Suprema Corte e atuou lá por mais de 20 anos, sempre com o mesmo perfil de um homem público sério e comprometido com a defesa das igualdades de oportunidades e a proteção dos mais vulneráveis. Antes dele ser nomeado para a Suprema Corte, inclusive, ele foi procurador, né, geral dos Estados Unidos por 2 anos, e também nessa atuação ele fez o seu papel nesse processo progressista de defesa. O legado dele é duradouro porque as suas decisões, a partir não só do ativismo judicial, mas especificamente também da análise detida dos casos, faz com que ele e a sua trajetória inspire não apenas os afro-americanos, mas todos nós que temos muito o que aprender com esse grande jurista. Bem, no próximo slide a gente tem temas específicos, né, da atuação do Marshal, a luta pela segregação. Ele foi conhecido como um juiz progressista na Suprema Corte, né, em que ele defendeu os direitos civis, igualdade de oportunidades, enfim, ele sempre um homem à frente do seu tempo. E não apenas com relação à discriminação racial, né, mas em todas as outras áreas em que há discriminação, o Marshal também pôde atuar e deixar o seu legado. Bem, vamos passar, professor, podemos passar esses próximos slides aí. O Thurgood Marshal e a justiça social, né? Dentro dessa, ele tem 3 pilares que são lembrados como o legado do Marshal, né? Exatamente a luta pela igualdade, a transformação a partir do sistema de justiça e a justiça social. O Marshal, ele disse isso no julgamento, inclusive isso está no filme, que foi inspirado na sua atuação, né? Em que ele disse que a Constituição Federal, a Constituição dos Estados Unidos, ela não foi feita pelos afro-americanos nem para os afro-americanos, mas que eles iriam utilizá-la para se fazer valer da igualdade formal que ela atribuía a todos os cidadãos dos Estados Unidos. E foi baseado nesse princípio que ele conseguiu todas essas vitórias para a população afro-americana. Ele não atuava apenas para um cliente. específico para aquele caso específico, mas sim para toda a sociedade afro-americana. Eram 13 milhões de afro-americanos que dependiam da sua atuação. Por fim, o legado dele é um legado que perdura, né? Ele tem um pioneirismo jurídico, né? De ter sido o primeiro juiz afro-americano a fazer parte da Suprema Corte, de ter atuado intensamente na luta pelos direitos civis, de ter defendido incansavelmente a igualdade de oportunidades e de inspirar toda uma geração, não só de estudantes de direito, mas de advogados e de todas as pessoas que buscam lutar pela justiça. Ainda há desafios, né, desafios atuais e perspectivas futuras que o legado do Marshal precisa de complemento. Nós precisamos continuar essa batalha. Há desigualdades persistentes, há polarização política, há inovação jurídica também como instrumento de promoção de igualdade, há empoderamento comunitário. Hoje, os Estados Unidos, eles possuem, ainda hoje, melhor dizendo, uma série de desigualdades que o sistema impõe às populações afro-americanas, né? Hoje, a média de riqueza de uma família branca é 10 vezes maior do que das famílias negras. A taxa de pobreza é quase 3 vezes maior entre negros e brancos, por exemplo. Embora os afro-americanos representem 13% da população, eles são quase 25% dos presos. E a taxa de encarceramento continua 5 vezes maior do que os brancos, ou seja, essa proporção tende ainda a aumentar. Fora a quantidade muito maior de pessoas pretas que são mortas em atividades policiais do que pessoas brancas. Inclusive, há, professor, alguns estudos que vão demonstrando que essa desproporção ela acontece também no sistema de saúde, na economia, até o número de abortamentos de crianças, de bebês pretos, são maiores do que de bebês brancos, embora dentro de determinado contexto, como por exemplo Nova York, o acesso seja facilitado para ambos os públicos. Bem, então, a partir de todo esse cenário, percebemos que nós ainda temos bastante que continuar o que foi precedido pelo Marshal, e que não apenas as relações raciais aqui no Brasil, que é o nosso objeto, né, de estudo, é a nossa vivência cotidiana, mas as relações raciais em toda a América, especificamente nos Estados Unidos também, demanda toda uma atenção e um legado, e um estudo e as diversas conexões, que é o que o professor Heron está promovendo aqui com o convite ao professor Kenneth, consegue nos moldar e nos trazer perspectivas de disputa nesse campo de direito e relações raciais. É isso. Muito obrigado.
Muito obrigado, Ulisses, pela sua bela exposição e parabéns pela pesquisa aí, em trazer esse exemplo aí do jurista negro americano para a nossa disciplina. Eu quero apresentar agora o professor Kenneth Williams. O professor Kenneth Williams é um amigo do Brasil, uma pessoa que está sempre aqui em contato com a Bahia, veio para a Bahia pela Fulbright e ficou sob a minha supervisão e se apaixonou pela Bahia e mantém contato sempre aqui com a gente, está sempre presente. Contava que esteve recentemente em Lisboa e lá ele foi no restaurante brasileiro para comer acarajé. Ou seja, uma ligação muito forte com a Bahia. Texas. Texas Tech University. Mas ele já foi professor também da South Texas College of Law, também Então, ele ensina numa universidade que tem o próprio nome do nosso analisado nessa data. Ele fez a graduação dele na Universidade of Virginia, o JD, e fez a sua graduação na Universidade de São Francisco. Kenneth Williams é autor de vários livros e um dos maiores especialistas nos Estados Unidos em defender presos da pena de morte. É um advogado criminalista e, portanto, ele tem vários livros como Criminal Law, Concept, Crimes and Defense e Most Deserving of Death, An Analysis of the Supreme Court's Death Penalty Jurisprudence. Ou seja, as pessoas, a maioria merecem a morte, né? Muitos merecem a morte, é uma pergunta que ele faz, analisando aí a jurisprudência norte-americana e vários capítulos de livro. Professor Kenneth, it's a pleasure to receive you one more time here in Brazil to talk about Thurgood Marshal. Thank you so much.
Okay. Thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Can you hear me? Okay. Yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. Muito obrigado. So many Portuguese William, so I speak in English, but I will speak slow. So Thurgood Marshal is the Okay. I had it on mute. Okay. To start over. Okay. I'm very happy to be here, and thank you for the invitation to speak here. I always enjoy speaking here, and I enjoy being in Salvador and Bahia. So Thurgood Marshall was the first Black to serve in the U.S. Supreme Court. But he also had a very distinguished career before he made it onto the Supreme Court, before he was appointed to the Supreme Court. He was also the first Black to serve as Solicitor General of the United States. And the Solicitor General of the United States is the person who argues on behalf of the U.S. government before the Supreme Court. Okay, and it's a very prestigious position. Oftentimes, it leads to a Supreme Court nomination. So, for instance, our current Justice Kagan, she served also as the Solicitor General before joining the court. So, I'm going to talk about some of the cases that he brought while he was a lawyer and some of the impact that he had while he was on the Supreme Court. Justice Marshall he was born in Baltimore, Maryland. He wanted to be a lawyer. He went to law school. He had to go to law school, though, a predominantly Black, historically Black law school, totally Black at the time, law school, Howard University in Washington, D.C. He cannot attend the law school in his own home state, the University of Maryland, because at the time he could not attend because of segregation. He could not attend the University of Maryland. So he had to go to law school in Washington, D.C., which was about 40 miles from Baltimore. And his time on the court was obviously very important, but also the time he spent as a lawyer fighting for justice, fighting to make the Constitution available to everyone, and that everyone be created equally under the Constitution, was a big part of his career also. So when he finished law school, he obviously passed the bar, he became a lawyer. And the first thing he did was he represented a group that was boycotting grocery stores in Baltimore. And basically the goal was, the name of the group was Don't Buy Where You Won't Be Hired. And they were complaining that these grocery stores were taking Black people's money, but they wouldn't hire Black people. And so they started a boycott of these grocery stores to force them to hire Black people. And Justice Marshall was the attorney for that group. After that, he became the lawyer for the NAACP, which is the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And that's when he did a lot of his most important work and where he had the most impact on the United States. The first thing, when he became a lawyer, separate but equal was the law of the United States. Plessy versus Ferguson. The Supreme Court had held that Plessy versus Ferguson, that separate but equal would be the law of the United States. And that's what he had to deal with. The problem was that things were separate, but they were never equal. Equal was not the norm. They were separate though. So we had enforced legal segregation. So what he did when he was the head of the NAACP was he developed a strategy. And the strategy was to try to make things equal. So the law said separate but equal, and he tried to make it, they were certainly separate, but they were not equal. He tried to make things equal. And the focus that he focused on education, because education was so fundamental. And his focus was on higher education, like graduate schools and law schools and colleges, trying to make those equal. He didn't focus initially on kids in school, like from kindergarten to 12, because that was a very sensitive issue in the United States. There were many whites who would not have allowed or been receptive to having Black and white kids go to the same school. But they were more willing to be accepted in colleges and universities and law school, where they would be adults. So his first case was, ironically, against the University of Maryland Law School, the school that wouldn't allow him to attend. And so he brought a lawsuit against the University of Maryland. Maryland would not allow a Black student to attend their law school, but they didn't have a law school. They didn't have an equal law school for Black people. And so he filed suit. He claiming that, well, the law requires separate but equal, and you don't have a separate but equal law school for Black people. So therefore, you have to allow Black people into the University of Maryland. And the court agreed with the Thurgood Marshall, and that the University of Maryland had to admit Black students. So this was the first case in which a white university had to allow Black students to attend their university. Okay, and he filed similar lawsuits in Missouri and won the lawsuit. The same thing happened in Missouri. Missouri had no law school for Black people to attend. So there was no separate but equal. There was no choice at all but to allow the Black students to attend the University of Maryland, a law school. There was a similar case that was filed in the University of Maryland, in Oklahoma, against the University of Oklahoma. And he was also, a Black student was allowed to attend the University of Oklahoma. Now, what they did was, I have a slide showing, so Plessy versus Ferguson was the law of the United States. It had to be separate but equal, supposedly equal, but they were never equal. And I actually have a slide showing how they tried to deal with desegregating the universities there. So basically what they would do is they would separate, literally separate, even though the black student was allowed to attend, they would separate the black student from the rest of the class. So the black student would usually be in the corner of the room, and all the white students would be in the rest of the classroom. And that would continue. They had separate bathroom facilities for the black students. The black students ate separately. So it truly was, they tried to make it separate but equal as much as they could. And so you had a lawsuit. He won a lawsuit in Maryland. He won lawsuits in Missouri and Oklahoma. All those lawsuits required that those universities desegregate and allow black people into their universities. Now, he also filed a lawsuit in Texas. The lawsuit was Sweat versus Painter. And Texas also didn't have a lawsuit for black people. And he won that lawsuit also. But what Texas did was something different. So instead of allowing black people into the University of Texas, Texas created a new law school for black people. It was called the Texas State Law School for Negroes. And so they created a black law school because they didn't want to desegregate the University of Texas. So the states had that right. They could either admit black students or they could create a new law school that would be separate but equal. And that's what the state of Texas did. They created this law school, which is now actually Texas Southern University, Thurgood Marshall School of Law, this first law school that I taught at, and where Professor Heron gave a speech some years ago when he was in Texas. His work, though, wasn't confined to education. He was also while he was the head of NAACP, the lawyer for NAACP, he was a lawyer in a case called Shelley versus Kramer. The Supreme Court held in Shelley versus Kramer that restrictive covenants were unconstitutional. So let me explain what a restrictive covenant was. So basically, it was an agreement. So the whites in the neighborhood, they had an agreement that they would not sell to black people. And any white person who would violate that, they could take them to court, and the court would force them not to sell to a white person. So they would have an agreement in a neighborhood that it would not sell to any black person their home when they sell their homes. That's called a restrictive covenant. And Thurgood Marshall went to court in Shelley versus Kramer and argued that that was against the law, that that was actually a violation of the Constitution, because the courts were enforcing these agreements which discriminated and was a violation of equal protection. And he won that lawsuit. So in the United States now, we have no longer these restrictive covenants based on race. So you can't have an agreement. The people in the neighborhood can't agree that we're not going to sell to black people, or we're not going to sell to Latin people, we're not going to sell to women. You can't have agreements like that anymore because of Thurgood Marshall, the decision, and Shelley versus Kramer. Okay, so his impact was felt also in politics. In my state, in Texas, he was the lawyer on behalf of black plaintiffs. In Texas, they had a whites only, they would only allow whites to vote in the primaries. And they had a white primary, and they would only allow whites to vote. And he sued, arguing that that was a violation of black people's right to vote under the Constitution. And of course, he won this case. So no longer could a state have a whites-only election, as Texas was doing then. So he struck that down. You can't have any more white-only elections. Okay. He was also a criminal lawyer. He did a lot of criminal cases. He was very proud to state when he was on the Supreme Court that he was the only justice who actually ever handled a criminal case. Our Supreme Court considers a lot of criminal cases. That's probably the majority of their docket, criminal cases. Yet most of the people on the court have never handled a criminal case. Justice Marshall actually handled criminal cases as a lawyer. And he would often point that out. Not only did he handle criminal cases, he oftentimes handled death penalty cases. What happened a lot in the South is that we had Black people who were being accused of crimes, and they would be charged with things like rape and murder against white people. There were always crimes against white people, rape or murder or battery, something like that, against white people. And he would go to court, he would go down there, oftentimes risking his own life. He had to have security when he did this, going to places like Florida and Alabama and Mississippi and Louisiana to represent Black people who were facing the death penalty. And he did that despite the threat to his life. And he was oftentimes able to avoid the defendants from getting a death sentence. Okay, he also was the lawyer. So he was the first criminal lawyer on the court to actually handle criminal cases. So he brought that perspective when he was on the court. He was able to explain how the criminal process worked. And basically, he was the only criminal lawyer on the court until 2021, when the Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who also is a Black female, she was also a criminal lawyer, but he was the first one to serve on the court as a criminal lawyer. And so that brought a very unique perspective to the court. And several of the justices would discuss the fact that they learned a lot of criminal law through Justice Marshall and his experiences with them. Okay, he also represented Black people in a case in which Black people were being excluded from the jury. In the United States, we have a right to a jury trial under the Constitution. And it's a right to a jury of your peers. But what many states would do is they would not allow Black people to serve on the jury. They would be all white juries. So even though the defendant might be Black, oftentimes they were being tried by all white juries. And he filed a lawsuit alleging that was a violation of the Constitution. And he prevailed in that case. So Black people now can serve on juries and have a right to serve on a jury because of Thurgood Marshall. Now, his most famous case as a lawyer is the one you're probably aware of, and that is Brown versus Board of Topeka, Kansas. So in Topeka, they actually had a separate but equal system in place, okay, as did most of the United States South and a lot of other places in the United States, but especially the South. They had separate, sometimes it was equal, sometimes it was not equal. Apparently in Topeka, they really did try to make the schools equal. The problem in Topeka was that Brown had to attend, so there was a school 3 blocks from her house. It was a white school though, so she couldn't attend that school. She had to go 6 miles to attend the Black school. So the Black school was 6 miles away. That's the school she had to attend. She couldn't attend the school that was 3 blocks from her house. And Topeka, Kansas in the winter is a very cold place. It's, that's a big inconvenience for her. So even though the schools might have been equal at the time, it still was a problem for Brown and plaintiffs like Brown. So, and Brown was important. Brown versus Board of Education was important because Thurgood Marshall changed his strategy on behalf of the NAACP. So before Brown, the strategy was to try to make everything equal. Keep it separate. We'll acknowledge the separate, but you have to make it equal. Okay, you have to provide equal facilities. You have to provide equal opportunities, equal education. Okay, and Brown, he was actually arguing that separate but equal was unconstitutional. Okay, that was the first time he made that argument. And the Supreme Court actually agreed with him. The Supreme Court held that separate but equal was unconstitutional. They ordered all the courts, the schools in the United States to desegregate. And they had to do so with all deliberate speed. Now, there was some resistance to that. Some of the white parents refused to send their kids to school with Black people. There was resistance throughout the South. Some states like Virginia, they closed all their public schools. They actually closed every public school. And they ended up sending their kids to private schools. But they closed all the public schools because they didn't want to desegregate. Yet some states like Arkansas, they just tried to defy the Supreme Court and said, we're not going to desegregate. And 2.5 years after Brown, they would not allow Black people to attend their schools. So Thurgood Marshall, after winning the case in Brown, he went to Arkansas. He represented the Black people in Arkansas who wanted to attend, had a right to attend the white schools. And he went to court, got a court order, and Arkansas had to desegregate its schools. And President Eisenhower at the time, he had to send federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, to force them to desegregate their schools. So there was resistance to doing that. He had to send actual federal U.S. troops to Arkansas to desegregate the schools. So he had a very distinguished career as a lawyer, and he had a profound impact on the United States as a lawyer. So again, he handled all these criminal cases. He created the right, Brown versus Board is the most important case. The right of Black people, you could no longer have segregation in schools. You had to, all the schools had to integrate. Brown also led to desegregation in other areas like public accommodation and other areas of American life. So Brown was probably the most important case in the United States history. I don't think that's an understatement to say that. It led to, so nobody was more responsible for desegregating the United States than Thurgood Marshall. Okay, he desegregated the United States politically, economically, socially, in every way possible. Legally, he was responsible for that. He was then, because he was such a successful lawyer, he was appointed to first the Court of Appeals in New York. He was the first Black person to serve on the Court of Appeals in New York. He was appointed by John Kennedy. And then he was elevated by Lyndon Johnson to the United States Supreme Court. And there was some opposition to him on the Supreme Court, the United States Supreme Court, him being elevated. There were some senators from the South who tried to block his nomination, but he actually did prevail, and he was voted onto the Supreme Court. And so he became a member of the Supreme Court. He initially had a lot of impact. He's had a lot of impact also in the Supreme Court. He wrote decisions, for instance, in Barber versus Page. Barber was a Black defendant who was being tried, but his accuser, he couldn't cross-examine, question his accuser. His accuser was in an out-of-state prison. They wouldn't allow his accuser, the prison wouldn't allow his accuser to be cross-examined. And so they offered just a transcript of his accuser's statement. And Marshall wrote an opinion saying, no, you can't have a trial like that. The defendant has a right to confront his accuser. Okay, so he wrote some very important decisions like that. Now, one thing that happened, though, while he was on the court went from being very liberal, we call it the Warren Court. We had a very liberal Supreme Court under Earl Warren. They created rights. They're the ones who wrote the Brown decision. They created rights for criminal defendants. They helped to desegregate the United States. They created rights for women, rights to education, et cetera. And but the court changed. A lot of those justices died. Richard Nixon was elected president, and he appointed more conservative people to the court. So Marshall ended up actually writing a lot of dissenting opinions while he was on the court, because the court changed while he was on the court. But he did make a big impact on the court also, the Supreme Court. Affirmative action was an area where his perspective was very important. He pointed out in affirmative action decisions that, quote, in order to get beyond racism, we must first take account of race. There's no other way. So he was a big advocate of affirmative action, and he would explain the need for affirmative action and why we needed it. And he did prevail, and that was the law in the United States until recently. Our Supreme Court has overturned, the current Supreme Court, which is very conservative, very controversial court, has overturned affirmative action. They've been overturning a lot of things recently. Affirmative action, the right to abortion. But anyhow, until recently, we've had affirmative action in our universities and our workplaces in the United States, and he was a big reason for that. Justice Marshall was a big reason for that. Okay, he had a big impact on capital punishment. In the United States, capital punishment is legal. The death penalty is legal. He thought it was a violation of our Eighth Amendment. Our Eighth Amendment prohibits cruel, unusual punishment. And he would oftentimes use his opinions to point out the injustice of the death penalty, the fact that it's racially biased, that it's imposed more frequently on Black people, that it's just inhumane to kill people for the state. You know, here in Brazil, you don't have the death penalty. You don't kill, your government doesn't kill people, whereas our government does. Our government actually kills people. And he would point that out, how inhumane that is. And the system was just unfair. You had situations where people would be sentenced to death by all white juries, where there'd be discrimination in that process. And a lot of times they were poor people who were being sentenced to death, and they didn't have good lawyers to represent them. And that's why they ended up on death row. He would point out that basically people who had good representation, legal representation, they would not end up on death row. If you had a poor lawyer, poor representation, you couldn't afford a better attorney, then you ended up on death row. So he basically, when he left the court, he pointed out that the Constitution, one thing he did was he challenged this notion of strict constructionists. Okay, a strict constructionist, many of the justices, new justices, conservative justices, they call themselves strict constructionists, which means that they only apply the Constitution. They look at the words of the Constitution and they apply it in a way that was intended when the Constitution was written. The problem with that is that the Constitution was written in 1776, and Black people weren't included in the Constitution. Women were not included in the Constitution. Poor people were not included in the Constitution. Poor people couldn't vote when the Constitution was written. So he would point out, while he was on the court, that we cannot have a strict construction of the Constitution, that we have to allow the Constitution to evolve as society changes and more people are participating in our democracy. So his time on the court was spent pointing out the need to have a more inclusive America. So in conclusion, we have made a lot of strides in the United States. We still have a long ways to go. We still have a lot of discrimination. We still have a lot of injustices. But a lot of the reason why we have made the strides that we have made is because of Justice Thurgood Marshall. And he had a very distinguished career as an attorney, a very distinguished career as a Supreme Court justice, probably next to Barack Obama, the most influential Black person, and Martin Luther King, of course. Those would be the three most influential Black people in the United States history. Barack Obama, Thurgood Marshall, and Martin Luther King. All three had profound impacts on changing the United States. So that's a review of Justice Marshall's career. And thanks for inviting me and allowing me to share my experiences with you.
Thank you so much. Okay. Thank you so much, Professor Kenneth Williams, for speaking. 10 years ago, Professor Kenneth Williams invited me to speak at South Texas University and at Thusgood Marshall School of Law too, in Houston. And in South Texas University, there was Professor Kenneth was the only Black professor. But in Thusgood Marshall University School of Law, there was a lot of Black students, a lot of Black professors. And the opportunity, the teacher asked me, what difference between the racism in Brazil and United States? Do you remember this
Oh,
guys?
yeah.
I would like to make the same question to you. What difference between the racism in Brazil and United States, and you live here in Brazil, and you can experience here in Bahia, and what can told us about that difference between Brazil and United States on racism?
I would say in Brazil, you have more social interaction between the races than we have in the United States. So in the United States, Black people tend to live among other Black people. They tend to socialize with Black people. Black people have their own bars. They have their own restaurants. Now we don't have legal segregation, of course, but Black people, for the most part, feel more comfortable being in environments with other Black people. Whereas in Brazil, you have much more interaction of the races, for what I can tell. The races, you have more marriage, interracial. Okay, you have more interracial marriage in Brazil than we, Black people marrying white people in the United States. In Brazil, that happens a lot more. Okay, yeah, that happens a lot more in Brazil than it does in the United States. Now, on the other hand, one thing I've noticed is that you have a lot more poor people in Brazil than we have in the United States. Black people seem to have more money, better living conditions, more political and economic power in the United States than you do in Brazil. So, for instance, we've had a Black president, we have a Black vice president now, we have Blacks on the Supreme Court, we have Black governors, we have Black mayors. Black people are more cohesive, more together in the United States than you have here in Brazil. For instance, we have the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Culture. We have many groups. Black people tend to be much more cohesive in the United States than in Brazil, and therefore we have a lot more political power than there seems to be here in Brazil. Brazil, you've never had a Black president. You've had one person, Black person on the Supreme Court. Here in Bahia, your governor, your mayor, even though Bahia is heavily Black, they're all white. So that strikes me as odd because, the United States, most of our cities have Black mayors. Philadelphia, New York, New Orleans, Atlanta, our cities where you have Black people, majority Black people, you're going to have Black mayors. So that's a big difference that I see. So Black people seem to have more economic power here, but in the United States, but it's more socialization of the races here in Brazil. And that's in the United States is by choice. Like Black people prefer to be socialized with other Black people. Black people don't marry whites as often as they do here in Brazil. So there are differences like that.
Professor Kenneth, one other question. The racism put a lot of barriers to the progression of the Black people all around the world. Could you tell us about what kind of barriers do you face in your life?
In my life,
in your life for being a Black person?
Yeah, well, I'm very fortunate. I'm a professor in the United States, so I don't experience the same barriers a lot of other Black people do. But, sometimes a cab won't stop for me. Sometimes when I go to a restaurant, I won't get served as quickly as some of the whites do. Some of the white people in my building, I might say hello to or good morning. They won't speak back to me. But I'm very fortunate because I work for a university and I'm in a university community with more liberal white people and more liberal people in general. So I don't have some of the same barriers that other. But I also have to be concerned about being stopped by the police being harassed by the police. That's a big problem in the United States. We call it driving while black. And just about any black person, whether you have money, whether you have status or not, oftentimes will get harassed by the police, get stopped by the police. So that's a real problem. I always have to be on guard when I'm driving my car to make sure that I don't do anything that forces the police to pull me over. Because we have a big problem in the United States with police shooting black people and killing black people or mistreating black people during traffic stops. But that's the main concern that I have living in the United States, being stopped by the police. For most black people, that's a terrifying experience to be stopped by the police because that can go awry pretty easily.
Professor Kenneth, how about the affirmative action in the United States today with the new Supreme Court?
Yeah, well, our Supreme Court last year held that affirmative action was illegal. It was a violation of the 14th Amendment. So we no longer have affirmative action in the United States. So our universities now cannot consider race. So we don't, when we admit students, we cannot consider whether or not somebody has, their race or anything like that. We can't. It's prohibited now in the United States to have affirmative action, and that's very regrettable. And what happened in California, they abolished affirmative action about 30 years ago. And what happened was a lot of black people stopped attending universities in California, and a lot of Latin people also. The enrollment went down in those schools. So that's the concern, that we're going to have fewer black people going to colleges and universities and law schools in the United States. But our Supreme Court held last year that we cannot have affirmative action, 6-3 decision of the Supreme Court. We have a very conservative Supreme Court now, the most conservative in a long time. Probably the most conservative court we had since the Plessy v. Ferguson decision and Dred Scott, which upheld slavery, and Plessy versus Ferguson, which upheld legal segregation. The Supreme Court is very conservative. And they held 6-3. There's 6 Republican appointees on the court, and they held that we cannot have affirmative action. So the United States now, we have no, I know here in Brazil you have affirmative action in your universities. We have no affirmative action anymore in our universities. So I'm on the committee, the admissions committee at my school, for instance. We cannot consider the race of the person. In fact, when we're reviewing the application, we're not told the race of the person that we're actually considering. So somebody applies to my school, we don't know who the race of the person is when we're deciding whether or not to admit that person. Sometimes by the name, we can kind of figure out what their race might be, if it's Martinez or Rodriguez or something like that. But for the most part, we cannot consider race. So we have no more affirmative action in the United States. It's all over. And I don't think that's a good thing. I don't think it's going to work out well. But that's where things are now. Usually in the United States, if something is good, if it's working for black people, they do away with it. So affirmative action. We had, after the Civil War, we had what's called Reconstruction, where they provided black people with the right to vote and other things designed to integrate black people into society. That lasted for about 20 years, and then they did away with it, Reconstruction. So every time there's something that benefits black people, they end up doing away with it. And affirmative action is the latest example.
Professor Kenneth, you grew up in a Catholic state, Louisiana,
Right.
and you moved to Virginia and to study, and after to Texas to be a professor.
Right.
That is a difference between living in for black people living in Louisiana or in Virginia or in Houston. What is the difference between living?
Well,
in that?
the South in the United States is where most Black people live, in the South in the United States, and that's because of slavery, because it was the South that needed the slaves. So that's why we had a civil war. The South wanted to keep their slaves, and that's where even today most Black people in the United States live in the South. Foreigners might believe that most Black people live in New York and L.A. and Chicago, but that's not the case. Most Black people still live in the South. But there are differences in the southern states. So Virginia, for instance, is near Washington, D.C. So it's a very educated state, even though it's in the South. And actually, it was the heart of the Confederacy. The Confederacy was in Richmond, Virginia. But now it's a very educated, very sophisticated state, very liberal state, much more liberal state and democratic state. Because you have a lot of progressives who live there. They work in Washington, D.C. It's very close to Washington, D.C., and so it's very different from the rest of the South. Texas is a very conservative state. They're passing a lot of laws against abortion, against immigrants, trying to limit what can be taught in schools. It's a very conservative state. But Texas has a large minority population, a lot of Black people in Texas, in Houston especially, and Dallas, a lot of Latinos in Texas because it's right on the border. But it's also a very conservative state because it's part of the South, the old Confederacy. A lot of conservative whites in Texas. So it's very different. And it's also very Protestant, evangelista. And Louisiana is different because it's more Catholic. And so it has a different history. Also more of the unions in Louisiana, so it has a history of being more friendly to labor because it's more Catholic also. And so it's a little different, but it has some conservatism, very anti-abortion because of the Catholic Church, but not as anti-immigrant and more, it's more integrated than, let's say, Texas would be. So there are some differences in the states. Texas is a very wealthy state, so that also makes it different. A lot of money in Texas because of oil. It's a very wealthy state. A lot of rich people in Texas. A lot of rich Black people in Texas. It's just, Louisiana is a very poor state. It's very poor. Comparison to the rest of the United States in comparison to Texas. It's one of the poor states in the country. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama are very poor states, whereas Texas is a very wealthy state. Virginia is a fairly wealthy state also. So even in the South, even though there are some similarities, there are also very differences in those states.
Professor Kenneth, how about the law in the United States today, or the moral? On the mixed people, what happened with the mixed people in the United States?
Mixed by race?
Yeah, mixed couple, mixed couple.
Oh, mixed, yeah, we have, it was the case before the Loving decision that a lot of states would not allow Blacks and whites to marry. So many states, especially in the South, nowhere in the South could Blacks and whites marry, like Virginia. Then we had the Loving versus Virginia case. This is a white man who wanted to marry a Black woman, and they were told that they had to leave the state of Virginia. They couldn't get married there. They could only get married in Washington, D.C. They could go there and get married, but they couldn't stay. They couldn't stay in Virginia as a married couple. And they went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in their favor that the ban on interracial marriage was unconstitutional and a violation of the Constitution. And so now we don't have any prohibition nowhere in the United States against interracial marriage. So couples can marry, if they choose to, the person of a different race. But that was the law for a long time, up until the 1960s. That was the law in the United States that against interracial marriage. And we still don't have as much interracial marriage, let's say, as you have here in Virginia, in Brazil. But of course, it's not illegal for people to marry people of another race. But yeah, so the Supreme Court in Loving struck that down. So that's no longer the law. But it had been a law since the founding of the United States all the way until the Loving case. Many states would not allow interracial marriage. Now, some states did before the Loving decision. Some states in the North, New York, for instance, Washington, D.C., they did allow interracial marriage. But in the South, it was not allowed. Virginia, Louisiana, those states, Texas, interracial marriage was prohibited. But the Supreme Court struck that down. The Warren Court, which is the more liberal court, the only real liberal court we ever had was the Warren Court. That was the Earl Warren was the Chief Justice of the court, and they created decisions like Loving, which desegregated, allowed people to marry of a different race. They're the ones who decided Brown versus Board. A lot of decisions that provided rights to criminal defendants, that court decided. But that was the only real liberal court that we ever had in the United States.
Professor, do you believe in the United States everybody can have a gun? Do you think that this contributed to the increase of violence in the United States, or is very important to the peaceful, to the pace? What do you think about that?
Well, yeah, I think a big reason we have a lot of violence in the United States is because of guns. So many people in the United States have guns. It's very easy to get a gun. Basically, in the United States, if you're 18 and you can get a gun legally. It's crazy. So you have all these people walking around with guns. And, people get in arguments with a lot of guns. We have a problem. We have these mass shootings. We have a problem. Stores. We have these mass shootings. It turns out later that person's crazy. That person has a mental health problem. But then they still legally got a gun. So almost anybody, if you're 18, that definitely are crimes. We have a big problem in the United States with guns that are being used for committing suicide. We have about 50,000 people who shoot themselves every year. Because so many people have guns.
Aliado. Okay.
So many people, a lot of people in the United States have guns, and the Supreme Court has basically made it impossible to restrict guns. So again, our conservative Supreme Court now, they have taken a view of the Second Amendment that everybody has a right to a gun. And so even if you have a mental health issue, you can still get a gun in the United States. As long as you're 18, basically, you can get a gun and legally carry a gun. And in some states in the United States, like Texas, you can we call it open carry. You can openly carry a gun in Texas and many states in the South. You don't have to conceal it even. You can walk around with your gun. And that's called open carry. And in universities in Texas and other states, we call it campus carry. At a university in Texas, a student can have a gun. They can openly carry a gun on campus. Okay, so we have very liberal gun laws, and I think that's a big reason why we have so much crime in the United States, because of our gun laws. It's too many people are allowed to have guns, and people have multiple guns, and it only going to lead to bad outcomes. People kill each other. People kill themselves with the guns. Like I said, we have 50,000 people a year shoot themselves with their guns. They commit suicide, and we have these mass shootings. People walk into grocery stores and just start shooting everybody. These mentally ill people. And there's no real effort to restrain them or curtail the people who can get guns. Every time there's a shooting, there's an effort to pass some gun control laws, and it never goes anywhere because the gun lobby is so powerful in the United States. And so any attempt to pass a law to restrict who can get a gun are deemed, the Congress won't pass them. The only restriction in the United States on getting a gun, if you're a felon, you can't get a gun. Ironically, Donald Trump now can't get a gun. He had to turn it in. If he had a gun, he would have to turn it in because he's now a felon. That's the only restriction in the United States. So you can be mentally ill. You can, as long as you're 18 and you're not a felon. If you're a felon, you can't have a gun.
Professor Kenneth, do you believe the drug policy in the United States increase or reduce the crime in the United States?
I think the drug policies probably increase the crime in the United States because we have so many. We still prohibit marijuana, although many states now are legalizing marijuana. We prohibit marijuana. We arrest and convict so many people for drug crimes. And so basically every drug is against the law in the United States. And I think it contributes to crime because it creates a market for people to sell and people to buy drugs. I know some countries like Portugal, they allow these drugs to be sold. The government sells these drugs. Whereas in the United States, what happens is somebody will sell drugs, they'll get convicted of a crime, they'll go to jail, they'll get released from jail. And then once they're released from jail, they can't find a job because now they have a criminal record. So what are they going to do? They want money. So what do? They go back to committing crimes. They sell drugs or they commit robberies, or sometimes they get caught up in murders, these drug transactions. So yeah, I think it contributes. Our drug policies contribute to crime. Also, our drug policies are uneven because there's a lot of racial discrimination in our drug policies. So a lot of Black, especially men, end up going to prison because they're selling drugs, and they end up going to prison. They get out of prison, they can't find a job. They go back to selling drugs. They go back to committing other crimes like robbery, burglary, those crimes. So it is a real problem that we criminalize and we treat it so punitively. Even possessing a small amount of marijuana, someone could end up in prison, or cocaine or whatever. Yeah, that's a big problem in the United States, especially for our Black people. Like I said, a disproportionate number of Black people end up going to jail for drug crimes. And it just creates a cycle of crime, committing crimes.
Professor Kenneth, there are many risks in the criminal system in the United States. And what the government can do to make it better?
Okay, yeah, we have a lot of racism in the United States in the criminal justice system. Black people are more likely to be arrested. Black people are more likely to be convicted of a crime. Black people, we have the death penalty in the United States. Black people are more likely to be sentenced to death. And Black people are more likely to be executed. So we have a lot of racism in our criminal justice system. And so what things that the government can do, one thing they can do is make sure our juries are fair. We have a fair jury system. There still is some prosecutors who try to remove Black people from being on a jury. Most of our prosecutors are white in the United States. About 95% of all prosecutors in the United States are white. Okay, and so you have white prosecutors pursuing these cases. So we have more Black prosecutors. There might be more leniency, more understanding. So that's a real problem. You would have less racism if we had more. So we need more Black people participating in the criminal justice system as judges, as prosecutors, and on juries in order to eliminate the racism. And the other thing we need is more equal treatment in other areas, better education for Black people. Then they wouldn't end up in the criminal justice system if they had a better education. They wouldn't end up in that system. We have a lot of times Black people don't receive a good education. We have a two-tiered education system in the United States. Black people, for the most part, receive a substandard education compared to whites. And what happens, they don't get a good education. They end up committing crimes, end up going to prison, And that starts that whole cycle. So if we had better education, we would have more equitable criminal justice system because we wouldn't have as many black people ending up in the criminal justice system. We have a problem with guns, as we mentioned earlier. And guns are a real problem because obviously you can make crimes with guns. Black people, 50, most of the murders, most of the people who are murdered in the United States are black people. So black people are 13% of the US population, but they're 51% of the people who are murdered. And so we have a real problem with that, black people being killed. And a lot of times their killers are not brought to justice. And we have this proliferation of guns, which results in bad outcomes for black people.
About the political system, I was thinking that the United States, the biggest democracy in the world, with its own risk, then we have some problems, Brazil too, all over the world. But you have a different system from Brazil.
Yes.
Even both are president's list, but we have digital vote and other difference. What is the best and the worst in the American democracy?
Okay. Yeah, we have a very different, even though we both have presidential systems, we have different ways of picking our president. So here in Brazil, you pick your president by just a majority of vote. Whatever candidate gets the most votes wins the election. That's not the case in the United States. We have what's called the Electoral College. So every state gets a certain number of votes. So if you win that state, you get a certain number of votes. And you need the electoral votes. You need 270 electoral votes to be elected president. So it doesn't matter who gets the most votes nationwide. What matters is who gets the most votes in the state. And so what happens, especially for Democrats, they get a lot of votes in places like California and New York, but that doesn't help them nationally in states like Texas and Oklahoma and Louisiana. So every state gets a certain number of votes, and you have to win the majority of the votes in those states in order to be elected president. So we've had just recently, we had Democrats have won 7 of the last 8 elections. But Al Gore in 2000 got a majority of the vote, but didn't win the election, wasn't elected president. In 2016, Donald Trump was elected president through the Electoral College, even though he didn't get a majority of the vote. So recently we've had 2 instances of a candidate getting a majority of the vote but not becoming the president because our system, Electoral College system. The Electoral College system, by the way, was designed to protect slavery in the southern states. It was designed to give more power to the southern, it was part of the compromise, to give the southern states more power and more influence. Okay, so it doesn't matter how much population you have or how many votes you get nationwide. What matters is how many votes you get in each state. So the problem for the Democrats, for instance, in the election, is that they may get the most votes in the country, but then you have a lot of states like in the South that vote only for Republicans. And all those Electoral College votes go to Republicans. So Texas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Florida, Georgia. Well, Georgia is more mixed, but Tennessee, all those states, the Electoral College votes go totally to whoever wins that state. So give you an example. Texas has 32 electoral votes. Whoever gets the majority of the votes in Texas wins those votes. And so they don't split those votes among the candidates. So Texas has 32 electoral votes. Trump will win Texas. He will get all 32 electoral votes. So it doesn't matter how many votes the Democrats get in Texas. If they get a minority, they're not going to get any electoral votes. So we have a very different system, the Electoral College. So the winner of the popular vote doesn't become necessarily the president. The other thing we have a history of doing in the United States is denying the vote to people, We have a long history in the United States of denying the right to vote, especially to Black people. And that's actually still going on in the United States. There's still attempts to limit the number of people who can vote. Whereas here in Brazil, you have a law, I know, that you require, it's a law that everybody has to vote. We don't have that in the United States. We have probably half the country who doesn't vote in the United States. And so, so they are always trying to make it more difficult for people to vote. So they limit the people who can vote. We have this electoral college system, which then produces presidents who may not reflect the will of the majority of the population in the United States. And so our system is very different for choosing our president. So in this election coming up, 2024, Biden might win the most votes. He probably will win the most votes, but that doesn't mean he's going to get reelected president. So our election is really down to 6 states, if you believe that. We have 350 million people in the United States, but we have 50 states. 44 states don't matter. We already know how those 44 states are going to vote. The election's down to 6 states: Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Nevada. Those 6 states are going to decide who's the president of the United States. The other 44 states, we already know how they're going to vote. We can already count the votes now, the electoral votes from those states: Texas, California, New York, Oregon, Washington, Louisiana, Mississippi. We already know Kentucky. We know how those states are going to go. The election is down to literally 6 states. So what the candidates are doing, they're spending all their time in those 6 states, advertising in those. I live in Texas. My vote doesn't matter. I will vote, but it doesn't matter who I vote for, because Donald Trump's going to win Texas, and all the electoral votes in Texas are going to go to Donald Trump. So it doesn't matter how I vote. It only matters if you live in one of those 6 states. So it's a very weird system that we have for choosing the president.
In Texas,
You lost your sound? Okay. Oh.
vamos ligar aqui. Professor Kenneth, I would like to ask you The string I have a problem.
Okay.
I would like to ask you. United States is the richest country in the world.
Mm-hmm.
The GDP
Right.
so high, but similar to Brazil, there is a very unequal country.
Mm-hmm.
Uh,
Mm-hmm.
what what is the problem in the United States for so much money and so inequality?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we have a lot of wealth, very wealthy country, but we also have a lot of inequality. We have a lot of homeless people. You go to New York, you go to Los Angeles, San Francisco, you can see a lot of people living on the streets in the United States, a lot of poor people. And the problem is that we have a lot of people in the United States who feel like there is no obligation to help people who are downtrodden, to help poor people. There's an attitude that you should be, and it's based on religion also. You should take care of yourself. You shouldn't rely on other people. And you shouldn't have to rely on the government to take care. You should take care of yourself. So there's an attitude in the United States a lot of people have. The government should not be assisting other people. That if you're poor, you're poor because you don't have enough initiative to help yourself. That's your responsibility to help yourself, and not the government's responsibility to help you. So I think that's the fundamental problem in the United States with why we have such inequality. And then we've had presidents who've just pursued policies that are unequal. We have a tax system now that benefits wealthier people. So a lot of wealthy people are allowed to keep their income. I know in Western Europe, for instance, they tax rich people at a much higher rate than we do in the United States. So there's a lot of resentment. So there's a feeling in the United States that you should be allowed to keep your own wealth, your own money. And the government should not do. So we don't believe as much as European countries in redistribution of wealth. We have policies that are not designed to redistribute wealth. We don't believe in that. We do have Social Security. We do have some minimal systems in place. But there's just a general attitude that your life is your responsibility. And you shouldn't rely on the government to help you. And if you have a problem, you should figure out, and it's your responsibility to deal with your problem. It's your responsibility to get an education. It's your responsibility to find a job. It's your responsibility to take care of yourself. And if you don't do that, then you should suffer the consequences. But you shouldn't rely on the government to help you. That's just the general attitude in the United States. So there's a lot of resentment towards poor people and providing income and food and other assistance to poor people. And that's why we have such a unequal system. Even during our campaign, we have a campaign now, the candidates, even Biden, who's the Democrat, more liberal, he doesn't talk about poor people during his campaign. He talks about middle class people, helping middle class, but not poor people. So there's always been a resentment like that in the United States. FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, he's the one who created our current welfare state, like Social Security. Well, he had a lot of resistance to doing that, creating Social Security and medical care for older people. We call it Medicare. There was a lot of controversy over that when he created those programs, because there's just a feeling that the government has no obligation to help people. A lot of people believe that.
Professor Kennedy, we have finished our event. I would like to know your opinion. United States will be it's close to the new election. What do you expect the new American government? We face a lot of war in the world, Israel against Palestinians, Russia and against Ukraine and other conflicts all around the world. What do you expect the new president of the United States can do to reduce the violence in the world and to bring the peace to the world? What do you expect in this new election?
Well, my hope is that we're not going to have a new government. My hope is that Joe Biden is going to be president again for 4 more years. So hopefully we won't have a new government. But if we do have a new government, it would be Donald Trump, and he's made clear what his policies will be. On Ukraine, he will allow Russia to do whatever Russia wants to do in Ukraine. He's made that clear. So whatever Putin wants to do, Putin will dominate Ukraine. If Donald Trump becomes president, they'll just take over Ukraine, and Trump will allow them to do so. So there will be a big change. There won't be any more. You're right about in the sense that there won't be any more war in Ukraine because Trump will allow Putin to do whatever he wants to in Ukraine. And so that's not fair to the Ukrainian people, but that's the reality of it. If Trump wins the election, Ukraine will be under Russia's thumb, and Trump will not do anything to stop that. Trump also will withdraw from NATO. He's made no secret of that fact. So the United States would no longer be protecting Western Europe, the European countries, even some Eastern European countries now. Most of Europe now is in NATO. The United States, part of that, the NATO obligations that we're going to protect those countries. Well, Trump doesn't want to do that. He wants to remove the United States from NATO. So that will no longer be the case. So Ukraine will be under their thumb. The United States won't be under NATO anymore. And who knows where Putin is going to go next? Maybe he'll go to Sweden, which is on their border, to just join NATO. But who knows what other country he's going to try to control if we are no longer in NATO. But that's what's going to happen if Trump wins the election. With respect to Israel, it's going to be the same thing. He's going to allow Netanyahu to do whatever Netanyahu wants to do in Gaza. He's made no secret of that. Okay, he is completely pro Netanyahu, and there won't be any restraints. Netanyahu will have a blank check and can do whatever he wants to do. So those people are complaining about Biden's policy in Israel. Biden is critical of Netanyahu. Biden is trying to provide some aid to the Gazan people. He's trying to restrain Netanyahu. Trump won't do any of that. So there will be changes in both places if Trump is elected. Ukraine is going to be under Russia's thumb, and Netanyahu will be able to totally dominate Gaza. And the Gazan people, there will be more Gazan deaths. There won't be any two-state solution, no Palestinian homeland. None of that will happen. I think if Biden is reelected, I think Putin will have to negotiate to get out of Ukraine. I think he's clearly waiting to see how the election turns out. That's why he's not doing anything now in Ukraine. He's trying to wait to see how the American election goes. If Trump wins, then he'll just take over Ukraine. If Biden wins, then I think he'll realize that he has to negotiate some sort of agreement, which largely allows Ukraine to control Ukraine. So I think the Ukraine war will end one way or the other after our election. The issue is going to end in a way that Ukrainians control Ukraine, or will it end allowing Russia to control Ukraine? And like I said, in Gaza, what's going to happen is if Biden wins, I think Netanyahu will realize that he has to bring an end to this war, because I think Biden will have a much freer hand in dealing with Netanyahu. And you may see Biden cut off some aid to Israel if he's reelected, because he won't have to worry about being reelected. So I think he'll get much tougher on it. So I think what will happen is if Biden wins Israel, he will get much tougher on Israel, because he won't ever have to worry about reelection. If Trump wins, there won't be any toughness at all. Netanyahu will be allowed to do whatever he wants to do. More Gazans will be killed. There won't be any peace process. There won't be any two-state solution. There won't be any homeland for the Palestinian people. That's just the reality of it, if he's elected.
Christ. And how about there is a difference between the freedom of speech in Brazil and the United States. The freedom of speech in the United States is more liberal than Brazil. Even you can spread racist ideas and other totalitarian ideas. Do you believe that this kind of freedom of speech in the United States increase the division in the United States or no?
Yeah, I think it does create a division in the United States. We allow basically anybody to say whatever they want to. So you can be a racist, you can be sexist, you can be anti-gay, anything you want to say, anti-Semitic, anything you want to say in the United States, you can say it. You can go on the internet and say it, you can go on television and say it, you can go anywhere and say whatever you want to. Okay? So you can say black people are stupid, you can say all sorts of things about people. You can argue, slavery. You should have kept slavery. Somebody said that recently. So whatever you want to say, you can say it. And I think that does create a lot of division. And so that's why we still have a lot of our racial problems in the United States. So our First Amendment allows you to basically say whatever you want. The only restriction is that you can't create a clear and present danger. Clear and present is not danger. Okay. So you can't say that there's a bomb in the field. Okay. You can't say that you want to kill the president of the United States. But for the most part, anything racist you can say black people are stupid, black people are inferior, whatever you want to say, black people are monkeys. A lot of people said that when Obama was president, comparing him and his wife to monkeys. They were all over the internet saying something like that. Okay. You can do that. Yes, you can say things about anti-Semitic, Jewish people, a lot of anti-Semitism. Yes, Jewish people control the money, control all that kind of stuff. We had races marching in the United States in Charlottesville, Virginia, marching, chanting, "The Jews will not replace us." There's this theory in the United States that the Jews are inviting immigrants into the United States to replace white people with immigrants. And that's a lot of what's fueling our division. You have a lot of white people who feel like the country is changing, becoming more minority. They don't like that. That's why a lot of them support Trump. Trump is very anti-Democrat. He plays on people's fears about immigrants, about the United States not being a majority white country. The United States, by the way, will soon not be a majority white country. In about 20 years, the United States will no longer be a majority white country. California now is not majority white. Texas is not majority white. Okay. But the entire United States in about 20, 25 years will not be a majority white country anymore. And a lot of white people are concerned about that. And so they're on Twitter and all this social media and all this racism, and it's creating all this division. So we're at a time now in the United States is more divided now than since the Civil War. Some people say we're in the midst of a Civil War. It's a cold Civil War. Okay, we had a hot Civil War over slavery, and now we're having a cold Civil War where people are all over the internet attacking each other, and lack of stability. So yeah, I think our liberal free speech laws do allow for the divisions that we're facing. So the United States, I saw it in I think with Spain, probably black player, and the people doing that just got that would never happen. So you go to a football game or basketball game in the United States, black, whatever, nigger, monkey, ape, any of that stuff. It's all allowed. We have a history of the word nigger in the United States. You can use that word freely. You can call a black person a nigger, and there's no repercussions for doing so. Ape, monkey, all that is allowed. Okay. Same with Jews. disparaging things, but disparage Latino people, anybody, and gay people, if you want to, and it's totally unrestricted. Now, if you work for a university, or potentially, even there though, it's very difficult. Okay, we've had professors who have had theories that you know, black people are inferior. We have a professor now at the University of Pennsylvania. She doesn't think that there should be black people and Asian people at her university. They can't fire her because of free speech. It's a free speech. She thinks that black people and Asian people, she thinks black people are inferior. She thinks there are too many Asian people at universities in the United States. And they can't do anything about her. They can't fire her because of free speech. So a professor at a law school, think about that. Professor at a law school in the United States, prestigious law school, by the way. University of Pennsylvania is one of the most prestigious law schools in the United States. She's a professor there. And she says that black people are inferior. They shouldn't be in the law school there. And she said there are too many Asians, and they can't fire her. She's still teaching there. She's a professor there. They can't do anything about it because she has a free speech right to say that. So yeah, our laws have gone too far. I agree with your laws. I think you ought to not be allowed to be a racist, a sexist, homophobe, anti-Semitism. I think hate speech should not be allowed.
Last words for a more peaceful world.
Okay. My last words would be that Martin Luther King said that the arc of justice is not straight. It oftentimes will curve. So we have people like Thurgood Marshall, Martin Luther King, have helped to create a more just society. But we are going to have periods where things may not seem to be as just. But we have to persevere, we have to continue. We have to continue to work towards creating a just society and not get discouraged. So we're in a period now, places like the United States, Europe just had elections, where hateful people are prevailing in elections. But we have to realize that we have to continue to fight those people. And justice will ultimately prevail. We have to keep that in mind. Continue to fight for justice. And justice has prevailed going back to slavery, segregation. And justice will ultimately prevail. But we can't get discouraged by the fact that sometimes we are inside away from justice, as we are now. We have very important elections coming up in Europe and the United States, which will play a major role in the direction the world goes in justice.
Thank you so much, Professor. Thank you for coming, and it was a pleasure for you. Thank you so much. Bye. Ciao, ciao.